I am getting dangerously close to driving this beautiful V10 monstrosity, this lifted off-road Dodge Viper. The front suspension is made and installed. The rear axle is in place with custom trailing arms. The brakes are mostly done. But there is one very important piece of the puzzle that I haven't even started on yet, and that's the part that connects all this nonsense up here with all of this nonsense back here. The driveshaft. The driveshaft seems like a simple design, but of course in true Superfast Matt fashion, I overcomplicated everything, adding double cardan joints, Resepa joints, and slip splines, and in the end I still ended up with the simplest possible design. A long way to go for a simple design. Some of you want to skip all of the garage shenanigans. You just want to get right to the meat and potatoes of how to build a driveshaft. And if that's you, take your cursor, move it down to the timeline, and keep going to a different channel because we don't do that here. I've made a few drive shafts in the past, 2 for the S600 or 4 depending on how you count drive shafts. The first iteration of this was the cheapest way to do this. The S600 uses a BMW differential, so I just bought the BMW drive shaft off eBay and made that work. This was a 2-piece drive shaft, which was convenient for me because I couldn't actually package a single straight drive shaft in the car. I didn't really make this drive shaft, I just modified it, cutting it to length, welding it together, and then welding a doubler plate on the outside. It was cheap, and I considered just doing this with the Viper drive shaft, except that it was too short to begin with. And also I sawzalled it in half because I couldn't get the U-joint bolts off. The BMW drive shaft in the S600 did its job well, but the car was missing one important thing: reverse. It has a motorcycle engine which only has forward gears, so to add reverse, I added a reversing gearbox in the middle of the drive shaft. While doing this, I replaced the single 2-piece drive shaft with 2 single-piece drive shafts. The rear is your standard drive shaft with 2 U-joints and a tube connecting them. The front has a slip spline. This allows the drive shaft to get shorter or longer by a little bit to make up for the fact that this car has the structural rigidity of a wet noodle. The engine is rigidly mounted, but it does move. You can see it moving under the hood as you drive. The failure mode for the front drive shaft is to spin around, ripping through the thin sheet metal floors and disconnecting my legs at the knee, so I decided to add it. Anywho, this is a Dana 1310 drive shaft, a little overbuilt for this car, but you know, kneecaps. Dana makes a lot of drive shaft parts for OEM and the aftermarket, racing, and tractors. They do this under their Spicer brand. They have standard sizes like 1210, 1310, 1350, 1410, and so on. A lot of Jeeps came with the 1310 size. The Viper came with 1350. There are probably other sizes from other manufacturers, but we're going to stick with Dana for simplicity's sake. Also, because the Viper drive shaft was made by Dana, the Jeep axle I'm using is made by Dana, and the adapter I need for the axle only comes in that size, but I am getting ahead of myself. There are some aspects of your drive shaft design that will be dictated by the vehicle. The length will be dictated by your transmission output location relative to your differential input. The ends of your drive shaft might be limited by the flange or yoke coming out of your transmission or differential. Also, you might need one of those slippy tube things if your transmission doesn't come with one. For the S600, the rear flange was dictated by the BMW differential, which is why it was real easy to use the BMW drive shaft. The Viper has a 1350 slip yoke, which means the transmission has a spline shaft at the tail end, and the drive shaft has an internally splined yoke that can slide in and out. On the other side of the yoke are 2 loops sized for the 1350 U-joint. I looked around, and this specific spline size for a slip yoke is not very common, so I'm kind of stuck with this part. Well, not this part. This part is dirty and rusted and old. I'm stuck with this part, which is just this part but new. The rear axle does not use Dana 1350 or 1310 or any other standard U-joint size. It doesn't use a U-joint. It uses a Resepa joint. This is better in some ways. It is a CV or constant velocity joint. A U-joint is not constant velocity. If you rotate the input at a steady rate, the output will surge. It will speed up and slow down just a little bit every revolution. The higher the angle, the more it does this speeding up and slowing down. You can actually cancel this out if you have 2 U-joints. You offset them at 180 degrees and you end up with one speeding up while the other is slowing down, and your output is constant. For this to work, they both have to be at the same angle. It doesn't work if one of them is angled more or less than the other. This will be important later. The Resepa joint doesn't have this problem, but it does have other problems. Sometimes when you run these at really high angles for a long time, the rubber boot will fatigue and crack, and then water gets in and it'll fail. There is a company that sells an upgrade kit for these that makes them last longer at higher angles, but they don't have one for my generation of axle yet. A lot of people just ditch the Resepa joint entirely and go back to a good old U-joint. But if I wanted to stick with this type of joint, I could buy a used drive shaft from a Jeep, chop off the front end, weld on a yoke for a Dana 1350, and be done. Or can I? There are 3 reasons I didn't go this way. One is that I don't actually know the maximum safe operating angle of these joints. There are some numbers floating around the internet, but they're all different and most of them are lower than I need. Another reason is that my front U-joint is at an angle under normal driving. You usually want a little bit of angle in your U-joint so it's not always wearing on the same spot as it rotates, but this is more than ideal. Remember how I said U-joints have that surging at higher angles? I can cancel that surging if I use a U-joint front and rear, but if I have that CV joint in the back, there's nothing to cancel the front U-joint. The third reason I didn't want to go this way is that there are a lot of people who are paying good money to get rid of their Jeep Mazeppa joints and replace it with a standard U-joint, and while some of these people are just curmudgeonly old Jeepers who are afraid of change, some of them are doing it for reliability and repairability, 2 things I like a lot when I'm out in the middle of nowhere. Also, Adam's Driveshaft makes a yoke to swap out the Mazeppa joint for a standard 1350U joint, so that makes it pretty easy. But this got me thinking, since I can't tilt a transmission down any further, maybe I can swap the front U-joint for a CV. Then I can pretty easily angle the rear axle up a bit to get it pointed right at the output. CV joint in the front, nearly straight U-joint in the rear, everything is great. I'm not going to use that Mazeppa joint though. I'm going to use a different type of CV joint. 2 U-joints. Remember how I said that you could offset them to have the variation of one cancel the other? Well, you can just put 2 of them right next to each other. Done. Kind of, not really. The 2 joints have to be constrained, otherwise they'll just flop around. They do this with a pin and spherical joint hidden in the middle. The pin side replaces the 2 end caps that hold the U-joint onto the yoke. Unfortunately, the yoke for this Viper transmission doesn't have 2 caps that hold on the U-joint. It's all cast into one piece. You just press the U-joints in instead of bolting them on. And since the spline output on this transmission is somewhat unusual, I can't find a slip yoke that works and has bolt-on caps. Actually, now that I think about it, I'm not even sure that this slip yoke is going to work. I don't know how much it can slip. The Viper originally had independent rear suspension, so this thing hardly moved in and out at all. But maybe I can find a bolt-on yoke, one that bolts to this screw hole in the end of the transmission. I'll find one of those that has bolt-on caps so I can use that CV joint. I'll need the drive shaft to be able to lengthen and shorten, but that's easy. I can use this slip spline thing I used on the S600. Great, except I can't find a bolt-on yoke with the bolt caps for this transmission, but I could take this slip yoke, drill a hole in the end of it so it can bolt to the output of the transmission. Then I can chop all this junk off, lathe down a landing, weld on a flange, then you get the flange adapter for the CV and all the CV parts, the tube, the slip spline, the other side of the slip spline, the yoke, the joint, the Adams Driveshaft adapter thing, and there's a drive shaft. Or I could just weld a couple of yokes onto a tube and be done with it. With the rear axle angled like this and the transmission output like this, we end up with pretty similar angles on both sides, which should be great for this kind of drive shaft. There are a couple issues with this setup. One I already talked about, and that's the fact that I'm still not sure how much this slip yoke can slip. I have it set up so at full compression it squishes the rubber dust seal, which is not great, but it does only happen when the suspension is fully compressed. Normally it sits about here. This part isn't actually a seal, it's just a dust cover. The seal is inside. The slip spline spent most of its life right here, you can tell because of the original corrosion. So it can definitely run in this range. I might need a little more extension at full droop, but I'm just going to build it and see what happens. The other issue I don't love is that with the angles set up like this, at full suspension droop, the rear U-joint angle is a lot. I don't know exactly what it's going to be. We'll put it together and find out, but if it's too much, I might have to angle the axle up a bit and have 2 different angles at normal driving. This will add some vibration to the car, but the Viper is not exactly an S-Class Mercedes in the NVH department, so you might not even be able to tell anyway. If there's one thing I've learned in engineering, it's that the best way to find out if something works is to not engineer it at all. You just build it, then test it, and see what happens. So that's what we're going to do. That's right, after all the talk of problems and solutions and doing things the right way, we're just going to do the easy thing and see if that works. Some of you would be shocked how many things are engineered this way. The tube I'm using to connect these 2 pieces is a 3-inch diameter 083 wall thickness DOM tubing. DOM means drawn over mandrel. It makes for a stronger and more balanced tube than the cheaper way of rolling it over and welding a seam. The Viper came with a 3.5-inch drive shaft made from aluminum that was just under 1/8 of an inch thick. I went with steel because it's cheaper, it's easier to weld, and it's more likely to survive bouncing off a rock, which is a thing I've done to a drive shaft before. I can do some basic hand calculations on this tube and see that it is several times stronger in torsion than the U-joints it's connected to. I could thin up the tube and make it lighter, but that makes it more fragile in rock hits, and also I kind of want the U-joints to be the failure point since that's easier to fix in the field. Off-road drive shafts are usually just mild steel, but you can use other materials like chromoly, aluminum, or carbon fiber. I did consider aluminum. It would be kind of cool since that's what the Viper came with, but a heat-treated alloy like 6061 T6 will lose up to half its strength after it's welded, unless you heat-treat the entire thing after welding, which I don't want to do. You can make an aluminum drive shaft without welding, but any way you cut it, it ends up being more expensive, and I'm not really that worried about weight anyway. The whole thing's less than 2 feet long. The fact that it's less than 2 feet long means that I can completely ignore another important aspect of drive shaft design: critical speed. Everything is a spring, and every spring has a frequency it wants to vibrate at, its natural frequency. If you vibrate something at its natural frequency, even with a small input, it will resonate and amplify, sometimes until catastrophic failure. This is a bad failure mode for drive shafts because it usually happens at high speeds. It rips the drive shaft out of one side or the other, and then the engine or differential spins it around violently, turning the inside of your car into a game of will it blend. Basically, any imbalance in your drive shaft, or even inputs from the ground or U-joint misalignment, will amplify and make your drive shaft look like this, or if you're really trying to party, one of these. Fortunately, this critical speed is directly correlated with the length and diameter of the drive shaft, and there are several calculators or charts you can use. It should be noted that a lot of people have well-balanced drive shafts and run them through these speeds for years without problem. In any case, every drive shaft I've made has been short enough that it doesn't matter. On the S600 because the car is only 10 feet long, and on the Viper because the engine is 10 cylinders long. Now that we have all the parts, putting this together should be pretty easy, but of course it's not. The most challenging part was actually removing the old CV joint flange from the rear axle. Apparently Mopar installs these with the help of a coked up strongman with a 40-foot cheater bar. I tried breaking the nut loose with the breaker bar and the tires chocked, but the tires just sort of ran up on the chocks. I couldn't get any torque on the pinion nut, impact, breaker bar, floor jack on the breaker bar, nothing worked. I needed brakes for this, and the parking brake cables are just kind of sitting there, so it was time to make those happen. The cables that came with the Viper were too long, which is great. I could just shorten those. The outside diameter of the cables is bigger than any of the adjusters I had or could find, so I made some new ones. I just got some internally threaded spacers and some threaded studs. I drilled out the studs so the cable can go through, then I slathered on some Loctite and a jam nut. I measured the approximate length and cut the cable sleeves and cables to length. The rear axles have these little tabs here to activate the park brake, so I just need some way to make the cables attach to these. Jeep uses this joggle thing here to attach them, which seems fine, but also a pain to assemble. I decided on some clevises with pins, mostly because I had this thing lying around. I pulled out the threaded part, drilled it out, and chopped off the threads, making little barrels. Then I soldered the barrels onto the cables. The trick to making this work is deforming the end of the cables, fraying it out. The barrels have a countersink drilled in to capture the frayed ends. When you fill this with solder, it keeps the frayed ends out and won't pull through the cable. Be sure to use solder flux on this. With those installed, I had a parking brake, and I could try again to break the pinion nut loose, and it still wouldn't come off. My efforts to remove this were futile until I removed the coilovers from the axle, jacked up the whole axle, put a breaker bar on the pinion nut and a floor jack under the breaker bar. Then I lowered the axle down. It was late into the night, and I had to do this twice before it was loose enough to finish taking the nut off. Eventually, I did turn on a light so that we could share this adventure together. Of course, that was only the beginning, because to get the flange off of the pinion required a puller. I didn't have the right size puller, and I didn't feel like buying one, so I made one using some junk I had lying around, and it didn't work. Late into the night, I gave up on it. The next morning, I gave it another go with a big hammer, and then finally gave up and went to the auto parts store and borrowed a puller. Installing the new yoke was also a whole thing. When you torque down this pinion nut, it loads up the pinion bearings, and this load helps crush a sleeve that needs to be crushed a specific amount. I think you're supposed to use a new crush sleeve and a new nut for that matter, but I didn't because I'm feeling lucky. Anyway, you're supposed to preload this crush sleeve a specific amount, and it's not as simple as just torquing the nut down to a certain spec. There seem to be about 40 different ways to do this. A common approach is to mark the nut and pinion with a marker so you can just torque it back to where it was. Some people just torque it to 200 foot-pounds. That seems to be a popular approach. Some people just hammer it with an impact. Others just torque it down until it can't move forward or back anymore. The correct way to do this is to tighten the nut down and then check how much torque it takes to rotate the pinion. It's supposed to be something like 15 inch-pounds. The capital C correct way to do this is with the ring gear removed, but there's an additional torque you can add based on your ring gear. You are definitely supposed to remove the brake rotors, but most of the videos I see, people not only have the brakes still on, but also still have the wheels and tires. Obviously, your brakes dragging is going to change with such a small measurement. Fortunately, my brakes have never been used and still have daylight shining between the pads and the rotors. I pulled in my parking brake and torqued the pinion nut to about 100 foot-pounds, then removed the parking brake and checked the torque to rotate. My only torque wrench that measures this low is for my mountain bike, so I cobbled together some adapters to make it work. The torque was about where it was supposed to be, so I hit the park brake and cranked the pinion nut to about 200 foot-pounds and checked it again. Pretty much right where it was supposed to be. I didn't see any play in the pinion forward or back or up or down, just the lash that's supposed to be there. So it's probably fine. Then for good measure, I hit it with the impact just to be sure. I'm not too worried about over-torquing this since it started out with about 1 billion foot-pounds. At this point, all we have to do is cut this tube to the right length, weld on the ends, and install it. But to do that, we have to get the transmission output in the right location, and to do that, we need to modify the frame, modify the transmission mount, and while we're doing that, we might as well remove the transmission to scan the mounting pattern. And also, we need to adjust the location of the rear axle and fix the binding and finish the brake lines, wire in the locker, extend the shifter. Let's just buy a new shifter, and while we're at it, we can go ahead and modify it, and we're not finishing the drive shaft today, are we? It used to be that you had to impress people to get people to watch your show. Now you just have to impress the algorithm. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. All hail the algorithm.